This is the 2019 Hyundai Veloster N, and it's the first hot hatchback that Hyundai has ever really tried to sell here in the United States. It has 275 horsepower, it'll do 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds, and it's based on the all-new 2019 Hyundai Veloster, which was just redesigned. Today, I'm going to find out if it's any good. I borrowed this Veloster N from Hyundai here at the media launch for this car here in Northern California, although I paid for my own flight, my own rental car, and my own hotel in order to remain as impartial as possible. So here's the deal with the Veloster N. The first generation Veloster came out for the 2012 model year, and it had only 140 horsepower. Eventually, Hyundai came out with a sportier version, the Veloster Turbo, which had 201 horsepower. Good, but not as good as, for example, the Ford Focus ST with its 252 horses. So Hyundai redesigned the Veloster this year. This is the second generation model, and they've finally come out with this, the Veloster N, this car's first true hot hatchback version. The Veloster N comes in two forms. Both have 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engines, but if you get the base level Veloster N, you get 250 horsepower. Upgrade to the performance package like this car has, and you get 275 horsepower and a limited slip differential for better handling. All Veloster N models have front-wheel drive and 260 pound-feet of torque. Now, Hyundai hasn't announced pricing for the Veloster N just yet, but I'm expecting it to start somewhere around $25,000, maybe more like $28,000 when it reaches dealers later this year. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of the Veloster N, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the latest hot hatchback. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. Now I'm going to start with the most interesting quirk of the Veloster N, and frankly of all Velosters, and that would be the fact that this car has only 3 doors. There is only 1 door on the driver's side, and there are 2 doors over here on the passenger side, meaning that this car has only 1 rear door, which is absolutely bizarre. It is asymmetrical in its doors. Now, this leads to some very unusual things. The most obvious thing that I thought of was, what about right-hand drive? When they sell this car in right-hand drive markets, do they flip it so that there are 2 doors on the other side? Well, the answer is yes, they actually do. So that means that Hyundai has to build 2 different bodies for this car based on which market it's in. They can't just flip around the dashboard like every other car does. That adds some complication to the production process, I imagine. And in fact, the production process is more complicated than you might think, because it isn't just 2 bodies they have to build, it's the entire structure of the car. From this angle, you can see if you look through that the B-pillar on this side does not match up with the B-pillar on that side. That's because the front driver's side door is longer than the passenger side door, since the driver's side doesn't have to accommodate the rear door, meaning that the entire structure of the car actually is different based on whichever market they're in. That's pretty impressive. Another interesting quirk created by the fact that there's only 1 rear door is that there's only 1 rear window that goes down. Only the window with the door actually rolls down. And Hyundai has addressed that in kind of a cute little way here on the driver door panel. In your car, you have controls for the front 2 windows and the rear 2 windows, but in this car with only 1 window that goes down, there's only 1 rear window control, and Hyundai has placed it on the passenger side because that's the window that rolls down. Next up, still on the subject of the doors, I want to move on to something I have always wondered about this car. Yes, there is a door over on that side, but let's say you want to get into the back seat on the driver's side, maybe because you make YouTube videos and your weird fans always like you to climb into cars in the tightest spaces possible. Can you do it? The answer is yes, you can. You move the front seat all the way forward, then you pull this lever, and then the backrest goes forward, and then you can get in. Now, you're hampered from getting in by this weird seatbelt delivery thing, but you can move that out of the way, and then you climb inside, and here you are. You're on this side, even though you didn't get in using the door. And one final interesting rear door related quirk in this car. One thing I've always loved about the rear door in the Veloster is the fact that they didn't stick another ugly door handle like in the front right here like they could have. Instead, they integrated the door handle into the window line so you barely even really know that it's there. And it's vertical, which means that when you go to open the door, you just kind of pull it in the same motion as the door and it opens right up. I really love the fact that they stuck the door handle there. Now, next up we move around to the back of the Veloster N, and there are a couple of interesting items worth noting back here, my favorite of which is the fact that this car has the best third brake light in the industry. It is triangular and integrated into the rear spoiler at the top of the tailgate, and it's just so cool looking when it's on. It really looks like the rain light in Formula One cars, and I think it's a fantastic touch that makes this car stand out on the road when you're sitting behind it. And frankly, so do the brake lights themselves. The tail lights come on and they look really cool with this sort of Y shape pointing inwards, and when you put the brake lights on, they only enhance the coolness. One other interesting item back here is how you pop the tailgate from the back, how you get it open. In a lot of cars, it's under here, but not in this car. There's nothing under here. Instead, Hyundai has kind of hidden it. It's in the rear wiper assembly, this little piece of plastic that juts out from the base of the rear wiper. You just kind of walk up, put your hand under that, you push it, and then the tailgate opens right up. It is kind of a cool design. Instead of putting an ugly handle back here, they've integrated that into a very small space so it doesn't stand out when it doesn't have to. Now, next up, moving on to the side of the Veloster, one interesting quirk is the fact that the word Veloster in the Veloster script is integrated into the side of the brake light there, and where the reflector is, which is kind of a neat touch. Now, speaking of neat touches on this car, I want to talk about the exterior styling of this vehicle, and specifically the fact that I really like all of the relatively subtle upgrades this car has over the regular Veloster. You have, for instance, some red trim on the rear bumper and some red trim on the sides and some red trim in front. I like these black rocker panels that don't stick out too much, but just enough, and they have a nice subtle N at the back of them. These wheels, I think, are really cool looking, and they make the car look sporty without being overdone. And the spoiler, although rather large, is integrated into the taillight pretty well, and it's not overdone. The reason I bring this up is because this car looks how the Civic Type R should have looked. Instead of going way over the top with that car and vastly over-styling it, Honda should have made the Civic Type R more subtle like this and let its engine and its driving experience speak for itself. This car does hot hatchback styling well. It's supposed to be a restrained, sort of sporty look that sits on a practical car you can use every day. You don't need a 3-foot spoiler back there. One other thing I really like about the exterior of this car is the color. Now, obviously this car is offered in a lot of different colors, but I really love this blue color. I have no idea what Hyundai calls it, and I don't really care because car company color names are always really stupid. It's always stuff like Fluffalonian Mulathinous Pearlescent Volume 2. But either way, I think this particular color is really cool, and Hyundai must think so too because they have carried it over to some interesting places in the interior. For example, the seat belt also has this very same color. So does the trim in between the buttons in the center control stack, which is an interesting decision. Obviously, the stitching is this color as well, which is fairly typical. And then you have my favorite things. On the steering wheel, the buttons that change the drive mode are also this same color integrated into the inside of the car. That is actually pretty cool, assuming you're like me and you actually like this color. Next up, another interesting quirk under the hood with the engine. This car uses a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. Or does it? You can see the plastic engine cover clearly has 8 lines in it arranged in a V, so it looks like this thing has a transverse V8. I don't know why they seem to be pretending to have a V8 in this vehicle with this engine cover, but it is really stupid. Personally, I wouldn't have done that if I were Hyundai, but they did, so you can brag to your friends. Now, next up, we move on to the interior of the Veloster N, where there are a couple of interesting items worth noting, one of which is that seatbelt deliverer that I mentioned earlier while I was trying to climb in the back seat. Now, the seatbelt deliverer is only on the driver's side, and it sticks out about 6 inches to make it easier for the driver to reach the seatbelt when you sit down so you can put the seatbelt on. It isn't on the passenger side because the doors are different lengths. The driver's door is longer, and that pushes the B-pillar back, and thus it pushes the seatbelt back, so it's harder harder to reach. Now, the seatbelt deliverer can be just sort of pushed aside in case you don't need it to be all the way forward, or if you're actually trying to access the back seat from the driver's side. Next up, an interesting quirk of this vehicle is the sun visor. You drop the sun visor, you open the visor mirror, and the light doesn't turn on like it does in every other car. It turns out this car, you actually have to manually turn on the light, which is so weird. Maybe there's someone at Hyundai who really likes to look at themselves in the dark. And so they get angry every time they open a sun visor mirror and the light pops on, and they're like, no, I want to see only dark. So this car gives you that option. Next up, back to those buttons on the steering wheel that change the drive mode. These buttons are rather large, painted the exterior color, and they're very satisfying to press. The one on the left changes between Eco, Normal, and Sport. Now, the button on the right will change the car from custom settings to N mode. In the custom settings, you can kind of choose how you want the exhaust to sound, the throttle pedal response, that sort of thing. And N mode just kind of maxes everything out, including the exhaust, which actually sounds pretty good when you're in N mode. Take a listen. Next up, an interesting item is the climate control vents. Now, in most cars, there are two components to climate control vents. There's a little switch you can use to move the vent left or right to direct the air, and then there's a dial that you turn to control the airflow if you want to turn the vents off. In this car, those things are one and the same. You can move the little switch to direct the air, but if you move the switch all the way to the left, that turns off that air vent. It's actually kind of a cool idea because it cleans up the look of the dashboard. It's just one less thing that each air vent needs to have underneath it. Next up, moving on to the floor mats, which are a little strange. They say Veloster like normal, but they also say N. That's normal, except it's an emblem. Like you'd see the emblem on the side of the car, the back of the car. I always find it odd when automakers put like metal emblems in the floor mats. Like, you know, these are floor mats, guys. Not only are we never going to look at them, we're going to step on that. It's going to come off when my shoe hits it wrong one day. What's the point? Now, that isn't a very good idea, but this next thing is really brilliant, and that would be the headlight controls. Now, the headlight controls in this car are at the end of the turn signal stalk, just like they are in a lot of cars. You basically flip the end of the turn signal stalk and that turns on and off the headlights. Seems simple enough, but the problem is that because of where it's positioned, the steering wheel gets in the way sometimes. The font on that turn signal stalk is very small, so it's hard to tell where you actually have the headlight control. Hyundai came up with a solution for this. Whenever you start to move the headlight controls, a little icon comes up in the screen in the gauge cluster that shows exactly where you have the headlights turned, which is really a good idea. Then you don't have to look and try to see the end of the turn signal stalk to see where the headlights are. They did the same with the windshield wipers, which is something that always annoys me. Is this on off or is it on auto and it's just dry? I'm not really sure. Well, in this car, you don't have to guess. It just projects it into the gauge cluster screen. That's brilliant. And it's the same with the dimmer switch. When you go to adjust the dimmer, it shows exactly what level of brightness or dimness it's on, rather than you just having to look at it and kind of see for yourself. That is a really good idea. Now, speaking of that screen in the gauge cluster, a couple of interesting items in there. One is the fact that you have the ability to scroll through various different pages in that screen. You can look at your G-forces, you can look at your fuel economy, your tire pressure, but if you go to settings, you have to have the parking brake engaged in order to change any settings. I guess Hyundai doesn't want you to do this while you're actually on the move. So you can't adjust your gauge cluster settings unless the parking brake is on. But when you do get into settings, you have the ability to turn on something that I absolutely love in modern Hyundais, and that would be the welcome sound. This is unnecessary and very stupid, but I think it's interesting because it's a weird quirk. If you turn on the welcome sound, then every time you turn off the car, you hear this. Now, even though they call this the welcome sound, it doesn't play when you start the car. Instead, it just dings because you don't have your seatbelt on or whatever. But every time you turn it off, you get that lovely sound reminding you that your Hyundai is saying goodbye. One other cool item in the gauge cluster is the shift lights. There are shift lights on the top of the gauge cluster above that screen in the middle, and they come on when you're approaching red line. And it's kind of cool. The first light is that blue color again, which is a cool idea. But then it turns orange to let you know you're getting close to red line, and then red when you're at red line, and then it blinks to let you know that it's time to upshift. It's cool to see that in a little hot hatchback. That's a feature you normally see on Ferraris and other high-end sports cars. Next up, we move on to the infotainment system. system. Now, I've covered this infotainment system in some other newer Hyundai models I've reviewed, so I'm just going to cover a couple of interesting highlights. One of which is that if you go into sound settings and then priority, you can see that this lowers audio volumes when you shift out of park. Only there's a problem. This vehicle has a 6-speed manual transmission. It doesn't have a park. Now, I find it interesting that Hyundai is willing to completely redo this vehicle, left-hand drive, right-hand drive, and change the entire body and the structure of the car depending on what country they sell it in, but they can't even change the infotainment system depending on which transmission they use. That is an interesting oversight. I bet most Hyundai owners haven't noticed that, and I suspect maybe even Hyundai itself hasn't noticed that. And so those are the quirks and features of the 2019 Hyundai Veloster N. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Veloster N. The first thing you notice the moment you start driving this car is this is one of those cars where the center console is too high for a manual shift lever, so you're hitting it with your elbow. So I'm gonna drive with it up, which looks weird, but now it's like totally comfortable. All right, on the road. Quick acceleration one, it is quick. Does not have any torque steer. You do feel a little torque steer when you're going into a curve. You can feel it's doing a little something. The handling isn't quite as natural as Focus ST. I'm impressed with the acceleration. It's actually quite good. This car is not in the level of hot hatch of like Focus RS and that sort of thing. And so you're not expecting that. But in terms of Focus ST and GTI, this thing is magnificent. It's very, very quick. Downshifts are easy. Gear lever doesn't feel quite like you'd want from like a performance car. Clutch and gear lever feel more like a regular car, but at least they're not annoying. There's no stupid kink to the clutch. It's easy to put the car into gear, etc. Body roll is absolutely contained. There's very little body roll. Now I'm on a real smooth road. Yeah, this thing moves. I think the most impressive thing to me about this car is the acceleration. The handling is good, it handles as I expect, but the acceleration is just fantastic, even in fourth. I'm in fourth now and going pretty high up there, and normally this is where 4-cylinder cars start to kind of peter out, and this thing doesn't feel like that. This thing feels aggressive and ready and eager to go. I'm really impressed with the stability at speed also. This is no German car. You don't exactly associate the Koreans with building like an Autobahn style car that can just go and go and go at a high speed. But that's kind of what this feels like. I'm going at a speed that the Autobahn would be better for, and I don't hear crazy wind rush. I don't feel like the car undulating. It feels great. The transmission is just not, it's not quite on the level of some of the performance cars that, you know, WRX STI, car companies that have been doing this a while. The feel of the shift lever is not the same. The clutch has a little bit of lightness to it that's maybe a little too light. It's all good, it's fine, it's easy to use. I would say it's easy, but not necessarily like performance car thrilling. The steering is very good. The car pushes through corners very well, very easily. It feels lower than it is. It has sort of a coupe feel to it rather than like a hatchback. It certainly doesn't feel tall. One of the issues that I have with some hot hatchbacks is you do kind of feel like you're sitting up. The Fiesta ST and the GTI, they don't really have that problem, but some do. This one doesn't feel like that at all. One thing worth noting, the interior in this car is 10,000 times nicer than Focus ST with those stupid Ford plastics. This car feels like a nicer car than Focus ST. It feels more stable, it feels more planted on the road, more better put together. The entire interior feels better put together. The Focus ST though, to me was just, it had something special, like the connection between the steering wheel and what the front wheels were doing was just, I don't know that we'll see that again in a car like this. It was almost too precise, but it wasn't. But it was like, why can't anybody else do that? It was like, it was dancing. That was a cool, really, really good thing. But it's over. I mean, Focus ST is about to be canceled along with the rest of the Focus line, and this is a damn fine replacement. And so that's the 2019 Hyundai Veloster N. The Ford Focus ST is approaching cancellation, which means that there's room in the hot hatchback market for this thing to come in and do well with 55 more horsepower than the Volkswagen GTI and presumably a much lower base price than the Honda Civic Type R. I'm glad Hyundai made this car and I hope it does well. And if you're looking for a hot hatchback, it certainly deserves a spot on your shopping list. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Veloster N looks nice, not beautiful, but certainly not bad, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Handling is good, and it's even better in N mode, but it doesn't quite reach hot hatch leaders like the Focus RS, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is strong for a car like this, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor, however, isn't especially high. Hyundai has a long way to go before establishing the N brand as a sporty alternative to stuff like Ford ST and Subaru STI. It gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 26 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories. Starting with features, the Veloster N is well equipped but lacks modern luxury car amenities, which is no surprise. It gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is fine, although N mode makes the ride insanely harsh in order to get that good handling. Still, operate it in normal mode and it's totally tolerable for daily driving, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is surprisingly nice. This car is not just nice for a Hyundai, it's just plain nice. And Hyundai has made major strides in recent models with their interiors. It's not quite on the level of the Golf R, but this car gets a 6 out of 10, which is pretty good. Practicality, its cargo volume indicates that it should get a 7 out of 10, but the 3-door setup hampers that a bit. Why not just give it 4 doors? It earns a 6 out of 10. Finally, value. This one is hard because I don't yet know pricing. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, assuming pricing will be around 27, 28 grand to start, which is where it should be. If it's more like 25,000, I'll bump this up to an 8. If it starts at 30,000, that's too much, and I'll drop this to a 6. But with the 7, add up the daily scores, and it gets a 31 out of 50. Add it all up, and the Veloster N's Doug score is 57 out of 100, and here's how it compares to rivals. It's not quite on the level of the Civic Type R, the Focus RS, or the Golf R, but it's nipping at the heels of the STI, which painfully needs a redesign. I also think it's a better overall package than the new Miata, though it's nowhere near as fun as the Miata for pure weekend use.